Okay, I think we'll get going. So thank you everyone for coming to this session. We're particularly grateful to ISPP for giving us a space in the programme, especially to focus on the work of Jim Sidanius and in memoriam of him. As many of you will know, Jim was a very active ISPP member. He was a former editor of political psychology. He was on the ISPP Governing Council and was also awarded the Harold Laswell Award for Distinguished Contribution. He's so loved by ISPP and by political psychologists that the Jim Sidanius Early Career Award, that the Early Career Award was renamed after him. It's now the Jim Sidanius Early Career Award being awarded for the second time this year. So he's, when I first met Jim, it was at ISPP. Yeah, we all really remember him. So I think he would really, really appreciate knowing that we're here talking about how we're bringing forward his work. That's enough for me. I just wanted to help set up this symposium. We're going to hear from 4 talks. Sadly, 2 of our speakers aren't able to be here in person, but we do have them on Zoom. We will start with, now I've forgotten the running order. We'll start with Lotte Thompson, who's at University of Oslo. She'll be zooming in. Then I think we're moving on to you, Stacey. Sure. You're next, based at Princeton in the room. Then we'll move on to myself here, and then Arnold last, who's calling in from University of Michigan. And we've now lost the Zoom connection. Okay. So we might need to adjust that order. It's just reconnecting. You guys can see what I can see. You can see my family too. And then at the end, we'll have Felicia Prado has kindly agreed to act as discussant at the end as well. So we're going to try and stick it to 14 minutes per presentation, and we'll hold questions until the end so that we can have a more general discussion, if that's okay. So Lotte, if you're happy to share your screen, you can take the floor.
Thank you so much, Jen. I just need to move this so that I see the slides. What blew me away completely when I started working with Jim as an exchange student at UCLA, deep insight that evolved general, abstract, relational orientations motivate and regulate all of societal life. They function to sustain and legitimize different forms of distribution of rights and resources, and they're universally represented, but people vary systematically in motives for them between and across contexts, reflecting differences. They form the evolved social grammar of how we make sense of social life and of human society. Prominent amongst these, of course, are hierarchy and equality, and also the notion of group or unity. And they combine recursively so that we can think about between group hierarchy and equality as in SDO. And a fourth relational structure or model is also that of market pricing, argues my other advisor, Alan Fisk. That is the notion that rights and resources be distributed according to proportion, for instance, in terms of merit or effort. These relationships are cultural coordination devices with which people organize the meaningful, motivated complementarity of social interaction in society. They're evolved, but culturally informed, and they're the basis for evolution and function of culture and society. They permeate all of social life, all the way to our very sense of self. So the psychology of social relations is the primary source, even of the psychology of the self. And that's because we see ourselves through our relational roles, and hence with reference to the eyes of the generalized others. So the quotes in the previous slides were from this, my very first paper with Jim Sidanius and Alan Fisk. And basically, I've been working on the same topic ever since. I should add, though, that of course you also see
Sorry, we're just trying to change the internet connection to address those issues. That conference one wasn't working for me earlier, which is why I'm on the Hyatt one.
Yeah, connect to the other one. I would have said to the hotel that there's a problem, but we cannot do anything.
So we go back to hide Wi-Fi?
Yeah.
Of course, once you control for the group status of the respondents, this effect gets stronger. So here, in model two.
Sorry, Lotta, would you mind showing us just your last two slides? We lost connectivity there for a moment.
Okay, so here, you didn't see this, or?
Yeah, if you could start here.
Okay, so because these relational orientations respond to the ecology in which one finds oneself, preference for group dominance track and mediate the effects of macro-level social inequality and violence across societies. So this is a paper with my former student, Jonas Kunst, and with Jim Sidanius, looking at various sort of macro indices of inequality. And that's related to higher SDO levels amongst members of dominant groups. It's also the case that SDO tracks parasite stress across ecologies, across countries, and also across US states, as shown here. And of course, once you control for the group status of the respondents, this effect gets stronger. This is work with Brian O'Shea. Why would SDO track ecological parasite stress? Well, one argument is the behavioral immune system functions to avoid novel pathogens and thus may lead to xenophobia. But it's also the case that ecological disease load limits economic development and increases resource stress, conflict, and inequality, which would in itself increase SDO amongst members of dominant groups. Note also that subordinate groups who already have worse living conditions will be more vulnerable to transmittable diseases, which will again increase inequality, which will again increase SDO among members of dominant groups. Okay. If there are evolved adaptive relational strategies, then they should have at least some genetically underpinned variation that corresponds to the systematic individual variation in SDO. And indeed, correlations between social dominance orientation and political attitudes that function to monopolize resources and territory reflect common genetic underpinnings. So here you see the green bars are plotting the genetic overlap between SDO and these specific policies, whereas the yellow ones are plotting the overlap in environments. People also vary in how they perceive and how much they respond to injustice, also how sensitive they are to injustice. But it's also the case that justice insensitivity is undergirded by two latent structures. One where injustice to anyone is equally bad, and one morally opportunistic factor where the worse you think it is to be the victim of injustice, the less you think it's a problem to be the perpetrator, observer, or beneficiary of it. And again, this morally opportunistic injustice sensitive factor is heritable, and it shares genetic overlap with SDO, opposition to immigration and developmental aid, and negatively with altruism and interpersonal trust. Thirdly, if there are evolved motivated relational coordination rules, then they might manifest as soon as the socialization process begins in earliest development. And indeed, there's now ample evidence that pre-verbal infants do represent social dominance in the sense that they expect more formidable agents in terms of strength or coalition size or previous win-lose patterns to win in zero-sum conflict. So they're surprised if a stronger agent yields to a weaker one and look longer, and that suggests that their expectations were violated. They also, and that is 2-year-olds, also themselves prefer agents to whom others submit voluntarily in conflict, but they avoid those who use brute force to have their way. And that suggests that already by the 2nd year of life, this notion of if there's a hierarchy, it has to be consensual for it to sort of submit adaptive benefits is already in place. building on this work, we wanted to look more on the fact that SDO is higher among males across nations. So we wanted to look at the developmental origins of these gendered coalitional formidability motives. And to do that, we showed preschoolers the following video.
Nå kommer det en liten film, og så kommer det noen spørsmål om den. Er du klar? Trykk på den du liker best.
What we found here was among Norwegian preschoolers, the majority of boys liked a member of the bigger group the most, whereas there was even a tendency in the opposite direction amongst girls. And this gender difference was significant. These gender differences in coalitional formidability, preferences, and motives held even among 3-year-olds. However, we didn't find an effect among pre-verbal infants, and not for lack of trying. We tested 150 infants. So that suggests that these gender differences and sort of an orientation towards bigger and stronger groups do not manifest or come into play, so to speak, until children start navigating peer relationships on their own. However, it is the case that even pre-verbal infants expect an age in watching these two groups moving about in coordinated ways to join the larger group, as tapped by the anticipatory looks. Then you might ask, does this or do these early, simple and abstract psychological mechanisms have anything to do with political psychology and ideology? Well, one way of looking at that is to use the same stimuli with adults in online survey, which we did. And here, the single item indication that one would join the larger group correlates with SDO, both dominance and egalitarianism, with support for ethnic persecution, authoritarianism, and also social identities. These are not huge effects. This is not a new scale, but it does suggest that there's a link all the way from earliest development to adult political ideology. And that brings me back to sort of the first issue, namely the question if the political and ideological psychological space is undergirded and motivated by orientations towards general abstract relational structures. To look at that in graduate school, I started this work with Jim Sidanius and Alan Fisk, where we asked people for the pictures below, imagine that each circle is a person, and the relationship between the circles is like the relationships between people in the group. And then we simply asked people, how much do you like groups like this? We also did overextensive validation work. When you do that, and you just have people rate these between group scenarios, this is an early sample, even indicating it abstractly like this, you see that it predicts exactly like SDO. So social dominance, RWA, welfare support, and so on and so forth. This is an early sample from UCLA. This is a reanalysis of data from 2009, suggesting that these preferences also relate to IAT as well as lack of fear extension to outgroup males. And finally, and this is what we were supposed to write up with Jim this year, and my bitter regret is that we didn't make it in time. These are some data from a representative exit poll from the most recent Danish general election. And you see that replying to these two questions and then the difference score between them relates to SDO, willingness to participate in ethnic persecution, and RWA. And it also relates to self-described political orientation. It also relates to endorsing a strongman rule and military rule. And what we did was we also asked single item indicators of policies that were discussed in the running up to the election. So again, you see this predicts saying agreeing things like climate hysteria out of control, or that we should deport 500,000 Muslims, revoke citizenship for Muslims, forbid Islam in Denmark, arm ordinary Danes, that only people with Danish blood are Danes, and societal rights should depend on ancestry and religion. So you get the general idea. I should also say this party was not elected for government. This is a data set from Jim's and co-authors and colleagues, the Syrian Lebanese data. And again, you see that these items also work in this situation with culturally specific issues here. So how do you feel about Hezbollah? How do you feel about Hamas? Are the power differences fair? Would you be willing to kill and attack military targets? But note that here the relationships are reversed, corresponding to a counter-dominance motive. The problem with these icons, though, is that you can't draw market pricing, and we've tried for many years. So what we did was we also wrote items corresponding to the SDO items, but then also tapping between group communal sharing. So for instance, all groups should be like one big family, and between group market pricing. So the benefits different groups get should depend on how much they put in society. And to make a long story short here, what you see here is what people actually voted in the elections. There are 12 parties, and they're ordered ordinarily from the communists to the very right-wing fascists who think we should kick out all Muslims. And of course, SDO, this is a linear contrast of what people actually report voting, predicts voting right-wing. Equality predicts voting to the left. But we see the same results with these pricing items and these communal sharing items. And in work Jennifer and I are doing right now, we're showing that actually combining all 4 relational orientations, you get increased predictive validity. So in sum, my conclusion, working on these things that started so many years ago with Jim, is that general abstract relational orientations do undergird social and political psychology. And I'm sure that's no surprise to everybody, anyone in this room. They operate across levels of analysis, from macrostructure across nations to perception of self to genetic correlates. They operate across development, cultures, and ecologies, and they motivate ideology and moral reasoning to justify rights and resources. Essentially, they form the fundamental social grammar that motivates and makes sense of social life, which we must grasp to understand the basic building blocks of human society. Thank you.
Thank you, Lotte. Sorry, Arnold, I'm reverting to the running order we previously decided. So we'll stay on Zoom and hear from Arnold now, and then we can move into the room after. If that's okay with you, Arnold?
Yep, sounds great.
Great. Thank you, Lotte.
Lotte, I need to unshare your screen.
Sorry.
No worries.
I think.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And now let me share my screen.
Looks good. Off you go.
Okay, great. I'm just setting up my. I'll be ready. Just a moment. Okay, well, thank you all so much for joining us today in memory of Jim and some of his many contributions to political psychology. I wanted to share with you all today I developed a couple of years ago with Norka Taylor and Jacqueline Chen, based on a lot of the empirical when I was a grad student in his lab. And as it turns out, as I'll explain later, based on some other work that Jim did with Lotte Thompson and Evergreen as well. This model is based on some of the work that Jim and I and others in social psychology and political psychology have done on how our socio-political motives can influence multiracial categorization. So most of this work has examined why white Americans tend to categorize Black, white, multiracial people as more Black than white, showing that whites' social dominance orientation, their system justification, authoritarianism, and racial identification can lead to this bias in categorization, as can anti-Black prejudice, which might stem from any one of these four motives. Just by way of review, although it might not be necessary in this room, a person's social dominance orientation, as Lotte mentioned, represents their desire for society to be organized hierarchically, with some groups at the top and others at the bottom, or their preference for hierarchical differentiation between groups. System justification represents a person's desire to defend and bolster the status quo. Authoritarianism represents a person's desire to maintain dominant social norms and punish those who violate norms. And racial identification represents a person's desire for positive differentiation between their groups and other groups, that is, for their groups to be higher in status than other groups. So in reviewing this literature on how our sociopolitical motives influence multiracial categorization and synthesizing it, we recognized at least two major problems. One is that in dominant groups, in particular, each of SDO, systems justification, authoritarianism, and racial identification are positively correlated, and each one of them can underpin prejudice. And so without, so data from these from these studies can't necessarily arbitrate between different theoretical accounts, because when you measure one of these motives in the absence of measuring others, you might not know which motive was actually responsible for the outcome. I'm as guilty as anyone else of doing this. For example, in some work that I've done, we examine how white Americans' social dominance orientation is related to their categorization of Black, white, multiracial people as Black, particularly when whites perceive a threat to their dominance. But we didn't measure in that work their whites' racial identification, so it could very well have been their desire for higher in-group status rather than the desire for hierarchy in general that was driving that effect. A second major problem we noticed in this literature was that it scarcely acknowledged perceivers from marginalized groups. It's primarily focused on whites, and whites in the US more specifically. And so we wanted to highlight in our model how these motives might operate to affect intergroup outcomes for perceivers from groups ranging in their status. Okay, so in this model then, we specify how each of these four major sociopolitical motives in the intergroup relations literature might directly affect an outcome of interest, in this case, multiracial categorization, as well as indirectly affected through prejudice. And importantly, how any one of these motives might be particularly active in influencing intergroup outcomes, depending on what situation is salient and how that situation maps onto the concerns of individuals holding a particular motive. So let me break that down for you. Well, in short, first I should say that this is a person by situation model then, that encourages researchers to measure motives that might be relevant in a given intergroup situation to test whether any particular motive contributes uniquely to understanding an outcome, controlling for the other motives, and encourages researchers to consider how different situations might make one of these motives most active. So a really great example of the strategy for understanding multiracial categorization biases comes from a paper led by Nora Katali, also including Jennifer Shee Steffington and Jim, looking at how each of SDO, RWA, and racial identification among whites can influence their categorization of Black, white, multiracial people. But what they found, interestingly, was when threats to dominant norms were made salient for participants, that is when participants were asked to think about a multiracial target who violated dominant norms in society, it was RWA rather than SDO and racial identification that influenced by categorization the most. As I mentioned, we also wanted to explicitly build into this model predictions about how each of these motives might affect intergroup outcomes for perceivers differing in their social status. So for instance, with racial identification, among white perceivers, it's been found that identification is related to the outgroup categorization of multiracial people, presumably because that might help maintain the status of the high status group. And then in contrast, for Black perceivers who have lower status in the US, although this was not the focus of this paper, we found in one paper that for them, their racial identification was actually negatively related to outgroup categorization. That is, it was related to in-group rather than outgroup categorization. And you can imagine how this might make sense from the standpoint of someone who belongs to a group that is marginalized, and that's a numerical minority. They may want to include multiracials in their group to engage in collective action with them, and in particular, if they perceive the multiracial group to be dependable allies. We also specify in this model how each of these motives might operate for third-party perceivers. And in this case, the third-party perceiver is someone who doesn't share a multiracial target that doesn't share a group membership with the perceiver. And in the case of racial identification, although this hasn't been studied, we would predict that it would not be applicable to their to categorization, because how someone who's highly identified with their racial group categorized as a person who doesn't share membership in that group doesn't really have direct implications for the standing or well-being of their group. For some other motives, such as social dominance orientation, we point out that even when the relationship between the motive and the outcome might go in the same direction, there could still be an effect of group membership or group standing. So for instance, we found this when we reanalyzed data that we collected several years ago on how Black and white American perceivers perceive Black, white, multiracial people, whether they categorize them as outgroup members or in-group members. And for both groups, we find a positive relationship between SDO and outgroup categorization. But interestingly, there's also a main effect of group status, such that only white Americans engage in outgroup categorization on average, and only Black Americans engage in in-group categorization on average. And this is driven by Black Americans who are lower in their social dominance orientation, that is, who are more egalitarian, which we show in the paper, predicts their perception of discrimination against Black, white, multiracial people, and therefore the perceptions that Black and Black, white, multiracial people are all in it together, have a living fate, and their inclusion of multiracial people in an in-group. Whereas for white perceivers, this was primarily driven by those who were higher in SDO who wanted to maintain hierarchical differentiation between groups. There hasn't been any research on third-party perceivers and how SDO might affect their categorization, but we would theorize that based on other work showing, and based on what Lota mentioned, that SDO is an abstract orientation for a hierarchy for differentiation between groups, that a third-party perceiver, say an Asian perceiver categorizing a Black, white, multiracial person, should still categorize that person as more Black than white, to the extent that they're higher in SDO, in order to maintain that hierarchical differentiation between groups. So in sum then, the sociopolitical motive by intergroup threat model is a comprehensive person by situational motivational account. It integrates motivational theories of intergroup relations to identify which person under what situations will affect intergroup relations. And it also emphasizes how these motives might lead to different outcomes depending on a person's group membership and status. Although, as you've seen, this is built on empirical work looking at multiracial categorization, we would suggest that this applies broadly to intergroup relations, and in particular, should apply to any phenomenon that's of relevance to perceivers holding any one of these motives. In fact, you might say, a paper that Lotte Thompson led, published in collaboration with Eva Green and Jim, was a prototype of the SNP model. In Thompson et al. 2008, they looked at anti-immigrant sentiment, actually immigrant persecution beliefs. And what they found, interestingly, was that when immigrants were portrayed as wanting to assimilate, that is, in breaching group boundaries, breaching hierarchical or disrupting hierarchical differentiation, it was those who were higher in SEO who were most likely to want to persecute immigrants. Whereas when they were presented as non-normative, that is, as not wanting to assimilate, as wanting to maintain their own norms, then it was those who are higher in authoritarianism who care most about maintaining dominant group norms who wanted to persecute immigrants the most. In our theory paper that we published a couple years ago, we also work out an example of how this might apply to other intergroup and political phenomena, such as support for Brexit. And in the worked out example, we also talk about how these motives might operate differentially depending on a person's group membership and status as well. Again, we think this might apply to any number of phenomena of relevance to individual holding these motives. And so with that, I'd just like to thank you all for listening. Thank Nor Kateli and Jacqueline Chen, my collaborators on this theoretical work. And most of all, I want to acknowledge and thank Jim Sidanius for his mentorship and collaboration on some of the early empirical work upon which this theoretical work is based. And also for his ideas continuing to inspire me every day. Thank you.
Check if this is working. Okay. Thank you, Arnold. Great timing from both of you guys. It's over to me next, so I'm just going to try to move the laptop over here a bit. Okay.
Can't see you, Jim.
Oh, yeah.
Jim.
Thanks for reminding me, Lotte. I've got to share my screen too. Okay, everyone can see the presentation in here? So. Great, I just need timing because I've lost the timer on my computer. Here we go. All right, 54. Yeah, 1 minute, 2 minutes. Okay, it's kind of sad to be here, but also really amazing. I'm just gonna minimize this, sorry. So thank you all for coming, and thanks again for the opportunity. Thanks also for those of us coming together to make this symposium. So, I mean, I often say to my students, you know, if you want to read one book, read Social Dominance, and it's very solipsistic. It's just because that was the book that changed my life. It's really sad, but I remember when I first heard Jim speak at ISPP in Paris, it was a talk on kind of something to do with violence and terror, and I was like, here's another talk on terrorism. Here we go again, Islamic fundamentalism, yada, yada, yada. I didn't really want to go. Then he came and he went up and he said, just to be clear, the kind of terrorism I'm talking about is state terrorism. And from then on, it was clear that this was a very different kind of political psychology theory, especially to the kind that was quite dominant actually in those early ISPP conferences. So yeah, Jim laid out social dominance theory. I then ordered the book on Amazon. I remember taking it out and saying, this book is going to change my life, and it did. It really is a fantastic book, and it's just as relevant today as ever. There's so much in there, and there's so much work to be done. So please pick it up, and please help us bring this theory forward and realize its potential. This is one schematic from a review paper on the theory, which gives an overview, in particular, of the fact that this is a multi-level theory that looks not just at the individual level, but also the intergroup, the ideological and the institutional level, in terms of trying to understand the ubiquity and persistence of intergroup inequality. What I'm going to focus on in today's talk is this notion of asymmetric intergroup behavior, asymmetric group behavior, which is one component of the group level of social dominance theory. Specifically, Jim and Felicia talk about 3 different ways in which, controversially, they say that members of high power groups are more likely than members of low power groups to behave in ways that advance their group's interest. So they say group-based oppression is in some way a cooperative game. And this is because of 3 different processes. One is asymmetrical in-group bias. We've since found quite strong evidence for that, which is that the higher in power your group is, the more strongly you are likely to identify with that group, to love that group. For example, we even know among children, when you measure implicit bias, it's attenuated among those who are in minoritized or low power groups. Ideological asymmetry is the differential ability of high versus low power group members to recognize ideologies that advance their group's interests versus that try to hoodwink their group into buying into the status quo. And group debilitating behaviors is specifically the even more provocative aspect of an already kind of provocative aspect of the theory that I'm going to focus on today. And this is the observation that people who are low in power or members of low power groups are more likely to behave in ways that seem to damage their long-term life outcomes. I've studied this specifically in the case of socioeconomic status because I was at Harvard and I was doing an interdisciplinary fellowship at a time when there was a lot of discourse around decision-making in poverty and decision-making of those low in SES. In particular, observations coming from behavioral economics around the fact that many of the poor are unbanked, that if you're those low in SES are not taking enough exercise, eating unhealthy food, not investing enough in education. And also, even though the arguments around healthy and unhealthy food should, clearly, I think, explanations for these should clearly foreground environmental factors, the fact that there's a huge expense of healthy food, the fact that there's predatory advertising from fast food companies in low-income communities. But observations such as smoking and drinking alcohol, things that are apparently costly. So there was this kind of sense that, well, what's the excuse there? You're actually making a choice. You're spending the little money you have on something that damages your life outcomes. Surely this is something that we shouldn't have sympathy for. And in fact, maybe this is something that psychology can help with. Psychology can help to get people into the right mindset to make the right decisions to advance their life outcomes. To help people to really believe in themselves, to believe that they can change their life outcomes, which we know increases the likelihood to engage in healthy behaviors. To not get distracted, to learn better executive functioning skills, to perform better at academic tasks. Keep your eyes on the prize, engage in self-regulation, stay focused on long-term goals as opposed to short-term goals. Try to look on the bright side, maintain positive affect, and lean on others when you can, maintain high social trust. So there's a number of different fields that I draw on in this work, one of which is, as I mentioned, social dominance theory, but just to flag that there are other areas looking at this. And their general approach is, the way I look at it is to say, okay, well, if you want to understand decision-making in context of adversity, you need to take seriously, sorry, there's my phone ringing. You need to take that context seriously. What kind of a context is that? And do we have an adequate enough understanding, given that we're talking about this from a middle-class academic and policymaker perspective? I try to focus on looking at the material adversity faced by especially people in challenging socioeconomic conditions, and also the social adversity, namely the scarcity and unpredictability of material and social resources. I'm just going to run through some key findings from that field of research so that you can get an idea of where I'm going with it. But in general, I try to look at these different decision-making processes and to think about the ways in which the patterns we see that seem to be of seemingly suboptimal behaviors might in fact be quite rational responses to these situations of material and social adversity. And if we take seriously the context of decision-making, and in particular to the extent that we can demonstrate that even middle-class people temporarily exposed to even a taste of the uncertainty, unpredictability, low status, ostracism, that is a daily part of the life of particularly those low in SES, then even we ourselves will behave those ways. We'll report having less control. We'll want to focus on the present. So, for example, thinking about material adversity and perceived control. This was some work I did with Jim as a PhD student. One way in which I got people to give a flavor of the powerlessness and frustration of not being able to pay the bills was just to play a household budgeting game. You have to try to meet your needs on a monthly basis. This gets harder and harder as you progress. You're either randomly assigned to be rich versus poor. So this is middle class people temporarily experiencing not being able to meet their budgetary needs. Those in the low SES condition report lower sense of control, and that also leads them to feel less efficacious when it comes to health behaviors. So this is just a momentary thing after playing this game. And I'm not trying to say that this is capturing what's going on in context of poverty, but I'm trying to say if this minimal exposure is there, then perhaps we might have causal evidence that at least some of the links between socioeconomic status and perceived control or health behaviors are caused by structure affecting decisions. It's not just material adversity, it's social adversity. A lot of focus in this work in behavioral economics has been on resource scarcity, but it's not just about having few resources, it's about knowing you fewer resources than others. I've tried to manipulate this experience in people, for example, by giving them false feedback on what their SES is in relation to others in society, and also by implicitly priming them to fill out an income scale that makes salient the sense that they're earning far less than others. Here's some results from that. If those given the low SES, low relative SES feedback report lower sense of control, but this is not just a case of receiving any negative feedback, because if you receive negative personality feedback, you don't see that effect. And it's not just in rating yourself in general on all traits, it's just rating yourself on dominance, assuredness, control, power-related traits, not on other positive traits. So it seems to be specific to a status feedback and specific to power control traits. That is sense of control. In terms of executive functioning, some work I did at Brunel actually looked at scarcity, this time in food. So we randomly assigned people to have breakfast after 12 hours of fasting. So you've got some people completing the task very hungry and some of them sated. We know that hunger has negative effects on cognitive performance. But is this just a case of the brain kind of shutting down in the face of scarcity, or might we be able to recover that cognitive functioning by changing the nature of the task? We presented two different types of tasks, a short-term memory task and a visual search task. I won't go into them in detail, save as to say that the critical within subjects variation is that sometimes the task involves finding food stimuli or remembering food stimuli. And sometimes it just involves remembering clothing stimuli or other stimuli. What we find, this is a short-term memory task, is that although there is this decrement in performance among those who are hungry in remembering non-food related items, there is no decrement and perhaps an improvement in performance among those remembering food items. This is a similar pattern for the visual search task, though here you can just see it on one of the arrays, that in fact it's those in the hungry condition who have the stronger facilitation effect for finding food. Everyone's faster at finding food, but those who are hungry are the best at doing this. So what's going on here is, I think, it's not a case of a cognitive shutdown, it's a cognitive attunement to addressing the need that's under threat. So this kind of rational adaptation to context. With Michael Price and also with Jim, we showed this in response to social feedback. So this is the low SES feedback prime, damaging cognitive performance. Is it a deficit or is it a psychological shift? Once you make the cognitive task relevant to people, once you link the same cognitive task, once you say that let people know how executive functioning is linked to later life gains in SES, then those who've just been given negative SES feedback, so who are experiencing a status threat, they don't perform any worse. So whereas the task is presented without that preamble or with a different preamble, you get that same deficit in performance. That goes away once the task is made relevant. This is just a replication of that pattern with a different task. So there's different ways in which we're manipulating tasks here. Sometimes we're changing the stimuli, sometimes we're changing how it's presented, sometimes it's the rewards. The point is, it's not a particularly complicated explanation. It's just to say that perhaps maybe if we move away from a deficit model in understanding the ways in which structural conditions can shape psychology, to actually thinking about, well, what's adaptive? What would it actually make sense for the brain to do in such contexts? And maybe we can design tasks in ways that uncover those strengths. And maybe we can design educational interventions. Maybe we can design application forms, health interventions in ways that recognize that psychological situation of low SES. Then we can not just, we can move even beyond a deficit model and be more nuanced there. In terms of self-regulation, some work with my PhD student, Julia Buzan, we're looking at using understanding society to look at how experiences of material adversity mediated through your self-reported subjective financial situation predicts the amount of cigarettes that you smoke per day, also whether or not you're a smoker. We're now looking at this longitudinally. With Ivan Cano, who's here at the conference, we've looked at low subjective SES and so this is, Ivan's PhD is focusing a lot on the emotional dimension of poverty and low SES. So here we're looking at how those low in SES both feel that they are contributing less to society and feel that they can influence less their life outcomes, and this is explaining the shame that they're experiencing and also their dysregulation of shame on a daily basis, one of the key emotional aspects of poverty. Ivan's work has also looked at, sorry, I realize you can't read the top. Ivan's work has also looked at social trust. That's the last of the mindsets that I mentioned. And we find that, we already know that those low in SES report lower general social trust. But what is general social trust? What Ivan and I do is we try to say, let's think about exactly who people are saying they're trusting. And it shouldn't be that one just generally reduces your social trust. It should be that you're more selective in who you trust. And in particular, that because you might be leaning on and more interdependent on those in your local context and not trusting of those representative institutions in wider society who have marginalized you, that we should see a link between SES and in-group trust bias. And that's exactly what we find. Those lower in income are more focused on trusting. When I say the in-group, this is friends and family. Friends, family, and people you know well, versus people from another nationality, people from another religion, and people you've just met. We're on 12 now, cool. Okay, so a summary of that work is that material and social adversity predict lower perceived control and lower positive affect. Perhaps this is a rational recalibration to the situation people are actually in. They don't actually have control over their life outcomes. And they predict selective executive functioning, goal prioritization, and selective trust. Perhaps these responses are quite adaptive to the context of people's lives. So that's the psychological shift model, which I'm not going to talk through now. I just want to close by opening this question of, where does this come from? Why is it that we feel that we have these mindsets that people need to internalize? And where do they originate from in the first place? Social dominance theory also has an ideological dimension that tries to think about where we get ideas about society. I mean, the notion of legitimizing myths in the theory talks about explanations for how society is ordered and what social groups are like. I'd like to extend this to considering even understandings of the self. And so I think the notion of neoliberal subjectivity, as put forward by Adams et al., a particular way of understanding yourself, actually quite nicely maps onto these 5 mindsets, right? So with Sabrina Paiwand, we've developed a scale measuring kind of each of these mindsets taken to the extreme, the extent to which you commodify yourself, optimize your behavior obsessively to try to fit with market trends and market needs, that you try to maintain positive affect at all times, and you try to instrumentalize others essentially to get ahead. And what we find is not only can we measure this and does it factor exactly as Adams et al. Predicted, but it predicts all sorts of negative outcomes such as narcissism, body self-objectification, social media addiction, more relevant to this conference, economic conservatism and neoliberal ideology, and in work with PJ Henry and Ivan at a longitudinal survey at NYU Abu Dhabi, we find it predicts opposition to anti-racist efforts, neglecting migrant conditions, even over and above standard predictors of authoritarianism, SDO, anti-white bias, and economic conservatism. Also support for top-down political leadership. So, and it also, and I don't really have time to go into that, among those low in SES, it decreases class identification and increases SES-related shame. So not only do these mindsets kind of seem to corrode all of us, they are particularly damaging for those low in SES, the same ones, the same people who we are asking to internalize these mindsets more, the same people onto whom we're trying to push these mindsets in a lot of very well-meaning development interventions. I won't have time to talk through this, but Manita Dingra and I are just working on a paper applying this in cross-cultural context and trying to look at different versions of agency and self-regulation, and arguing again that maybe this neoliberal subjectivity is a form of coloniality, arguments put forward, for example, by the Decolonial Research Collective. So in terms of what it is that we're advocating, it's not just perhaps suboptimal, it's also advancing a particular agenda that's about maintaining the dominance of those who hold the power and wealth, just as Jim and Felicia had said. So I think behavioral asymmetry is a result both of drastically different socio-ecologies that we're only starting to understand, and then of these kinds of subjectifying ideologies. The fact that even our understanding of ourself and our social relationships is itself ideological and strewn with power relations. Thank you. Okay, and over to Stacey.
We can't see the screen, Jen.
Oh, I thought it was still shared. We should still be screen sharing. Can you see us, Arnold?
Yeah, we can see your screen. I just didn't know if it was
Oh, yeah.
Stacey's screen.
Oh, but can you see how university? Can you see Stacey's presentation?
No.
Oh, yeah, of course. Sorry, because I'm only sharing that. Yeah. Okay. Okay, thanks.
Perfect.
All right, you're all going to see me adjust myself.
These are the later slides.
Hello, everyone. Woohoo, we're to the last talk. I'd like to begin with thank yous. So first, I'd like to thank my collaborators on this work. Nicole Shelton, Jordan Stark, Natasha Warwick. If you see anything interesting up here, it's them. If you see a typo, it's all on me. I'd also like to thank Jennifer and my colleagues on this panel. I'd like to thank Felicia Prado, who I just want to tell everyone was my undergraduate honors thesis mentor. I'd like to thank you for being here and sticking with us through the symposium. And most importantly, I just want to stand up here and thank Jim Sidanius for being such a formidable force in psychology, a wonderful mentor to me, and just, personally and professionally. So thank you all. Today, I'm going to talk about insights that social dominance theory brought to us that aren't overtly represented in my work, but I'm hoping that you'll be able to see their influence. So there are a few things that Jim and Felicia taught us through social dominance theory. And one thing was about the pervasiveness of the extant social hierarchy, the tendency for many cultures to organize themselves in terms of social hierarchies. And in particular, these social hierarchies are able to stand themselves up through hierarchy-enhancing ideologies, practices, policies, and there's a countervailing force, the hierarchy-attenuating policies, practices, ideologies that work to reduce the hierarchy. Okay? And it's funny because as a social psychologist, I remember the time when this insight was really controversial. It was, they got a hard time for being too sociological in their psychological thinking. And now you can see this idea is sort of part of the fabric of how we do our work. But speaking of how we do our work, empirically, work from the tradition of this theory has shown that even policies or contexts that are, seem benign, like a particular college major, like belief that if you work hard, you get ahead, that those still can have hierarchy enhancing or hierarchy maintaining effects. Okay. In our work today, or the work I'll talk about today, I want to talk about diversity rationales and the idea that perhaps these also seem benign, but have hierarchy maintaining or hierarchy enhancing effects. So what's a diversity rationale? It's an idea, an explanation for why people should pay attention to the group memberships of those individuals within their organization. Okay? So one reason or rationale is what we've called a moral reason. So we should pay attention to people's group memberships because it's the right thing to do. It reflects our values. Perhaps a concrete example is it will remediate past and ongoing injustice. Another rationale is what we call an instrumental rationale. So this is the idea that diversity is for some kind of practical good. So an example of that in higher education where we do our work, at least in the US, an instrumental diversity rationale would be we're interested in people from all groups coming to our university because it improves the education for everyone. And we call these rationales and moral and instrumental, but there are people doing this work under different names. So organizational psychologists would say the, I think, business case and the non-business case or the moral case. Matthias Koff would, I think, describes something akin to an instrumental rationale when he talks about pro-diversity beliefs. Okay. Now, you can see this line of thinking in lots of things, in legal documents, and university websites, and business websites, but my favorite example is Natasha Warku's book. So in her book, she did qualitative interviews with Harvard students and asked them about affirmative action, which is a common US diversity policy. And the students said things like this. So one student said, and she said, how do you feel about affirmative action? I'm supportive of it, definitely, because this country, everything is not fair, everything hasn't been fair, so you need to adjust for those things that haven't been done fairly. So you can see how this is morally motivated, and it has this hierarchy attenuating quality, right? Things have been unfair, there's an unfair hierarchy, and we want to reduce it. Another student said, I'm supportive of affirmative action because it's good for the college experience. Because Harvard doesn't need to send some white guy to Wall Street who has never interacted with a black person. He's going to be a business analyst someday under, a guy from Penn who, and he needs to know how to interact with people from different cultures. Right? So basically, here he's saying diversity is good because it gives white people a chance to practice on the low status group members during college so they don't embarrass themselves when they graduate. And this, I think it may be subtle to some or may be obvious to others, but the idea of inviting low status group members into this higher education environment to extract value for the high status group member, I would argue is hierarchy maintaining. And just to note, why I think this is important is instrumental rationales are the only legally viable diversity rationale in the US in the context of higher education at the moment. And they're also the predominant US strategy. Okay. Right. So what I'm going to do is give you like a really bird's eye overview that tries to make these points. That white Americans prefer instrumental to moral rationale, so the high status group member in the US context prefers the instrumental over the moral, especially if they are high in hierarchy enhancing ideologies. In the spirit of the political psychology conference, I'll exemplify that with conservatism. And also, again, along with this idea that we're maintaining the hierarchy, I'll show you some evidence that instrumental frames are associated with worse academic outcomes for low status groups. Okay. So with respect to the first hypothesis, basically, we've done a series of experiments. There are 3 that are published, but they're just a whole bunch on my computer right now. And we take this basic approach. We have people read about different schools, and the schools will have articulated different contexts in terms of the diversity rationale. So you can see in this one, for us, diversity is about justice and ensuring that people from different backgrounds have access to an excellent education. It will, and this will be our priority for our university, right? So you can see how this is moral. These studies are typically within subjects. So participants in randomized order would also read about a school that has a more instrumental frame. So this diversity is about students' intellectual experience and preparing them to excel. Okay. And then sometimes we'll have a control condition. Usually the control condition is something like this. So for us, diversity is a means of providing our many students with an excellent array of classes, programs, and activities. So it's about diversity, right? But it's not diversity of people, it's diversity of classes and experiences. Okay. And then after we do the manipulation, we ask participants, how much do you like each school? How much do you like each message? And how much do you want to attend each school? So to really show you this sort of potential size of the effect, this is one of 2 or 3 actually studies where we just had people do a forced choice at the end. Which school would you prefer to go to? And about 75% of our white participants chose the instrumental school over the moral school. Okay. Okay. And I didn't want to belabor with the replications, but so you know, we've replicated that basic idea. And consistent with this idea that it's, again, about hierarchy maintenance, and this is unique to the high status group, we found that Black Americans don't have this preference. If anything, they think about instrumental and moral as equivalent, or they prefer moral to instrumental. Admissions officers are well aware of these relative preferences. So we had this hilarious data collection where my students went into a college admissions fair and sort of surreptitiously passed out questionnaires. And the admissions officers, if you ask them, would say that whites prefer instrumental to moral and blacks prefer moral to instrumental. We also did a data collection with parents, and parents map on to the preferences of our online participants. And lastly, the admissions officers, when we asked them, how do you think students would fare under these different contexts, reported thinking that socio-emotionally, Black students would fare better in a moral context than an instrumental moral context than an instrumental one, but white students would fare better in an instrumental context than a moral one. Right? So we have the makings of the majority group prefers it, and the people who operate this particular system seem well aware of this preference, and because it's instrumental is the most common diversity rationale in the US, they are seen organizing their universities around the dominant group preference. Okay. Okay. So I'm saying that whites prefer instrumental to moral rationales, but if you dig down, it's particularly whites who are high in hierarchy attenuating ideologies. So across the studies that we've done, we usually pop in a measure of political identification where higher numbers is greater conservatism. And we very consistently, weirdly consistently find that if we look at instrumental morals, instrumental rationales, they have pretty bipartisan support. So conservatism is unrelated to how much people say they prefer the school when it's instrumentally motivated. Same thing with our control condition. But the more conservative our participants are, the less they like the university that espouses a moral rationale, such that the highest, the most conservative people prefer instrumental to moral. That was, I think, 12 or 13, which, you know, not doing so well on the timing, but we're going to just try and hurry up. We also coded university websites for how much the diversity language reflected instrumental versus moral rationales. And we then looked at Trump voting in the counties surrounding those universities. And we find the same exact pattern. So the amount of Trump voters in the counties that the universities were in was unrelated to instrumental, but negatively related to moral. Okay. And lastly, is this meaningful? Does this do something to the social order such that whites are actually doing better than ethnic minorities? Okay. To look at that, we took our diversity-coded websites, right? So we coded them for how instrumental they were, how moral they were, and we combined that with statistics on graduation rates by ethnicity and a number of covariates. Okay. And what we find here is if you look at this bar, or this line, these are the schools that are low in moral. Okay. So when a school is low in moral, the higher the instrumentality of that school, the lower the Black graduation rate. Whereas for the schools who are medium or high in moral, the influence of instrumentality is offset. Okay? And this pattern holds for Latinx graduation rates, another underrepresented group in the US context, but not for Asian Americans or for white Americans. Okay. So hopefully I've made the case that these diversity rationales have this hierarchy maintaining essence to them, such that the majority group prefers them, particularly ones who are interested in maintaining the social hierarchy. And this has the consequence of disadvantaging members of ethnic minority groups. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Stacey. Okay, without further ado, I'll invite Felicia Prado, who we're very grateful to have as discussant, to give an initial response, and then we'll open it for questions. Thanks for your patience on the timing, guys.
Hi, thank you for coming, and thank you for being patient through all the technical challenges that Jennifer's had to deal with today, and the other participants as well. I think, like many people, I feel very emotionally mixed about this because I miss Jim a lot, and as I know lots of people do. And also, I have to say, though, that there's a way that the talks today showed us how alive and well he really is, because there was such a lot of brilliant extension of and critical thinking about the kinds of things that he cared about and the ideas that he worked so hard on for so many years. So what I could do, I think, is just try and point out what I saw, what I think about what Jim was about and how I saw that in some of the talks. And I don't think, I have to admit that I don't think I'm going to do them justice, because I thought each one was a sparkling jewel and needed to be turned over in many different ways to think about it, and more than we've had a chance to do yet. So one of the big ideas that Jim had thought about was really, as Lota said very elegantly, what are the common patterns of social life? What are the things that people seem to create over and over in how they organize their societies and their intergroup relations especially? And if that's happening, he made this assumption, which is not the same as a theory, but it's an assumption that if you see something happening over and over, maybe it's adaptive. And then the hard work to do is the things like Lota has been doing, which is to say, and Jennifer as well, is why is it adaptive? Why? And to whom, right? How did that come about? But in that, in the sense that he was really interested in these larger patterns and wanted us to have very general theories, that was really important. And it's true that there was some criticism given about it, probably especially in social psychology, because we were told it was too big of a theory, social dominance theory, and you're not allowed to theorize that high, basically. And and certainly evolutionary thinking was and remains to some extent controversial, because it depends a lot, I think, on how you do it and how you say it and how well you do it. But he really was a broad social scientist, and that's how he viewed himself, right? I know that his primary identity was with ISPP and with political psychology, but he really thought that we should, all of us who are in the business of trying to understand human beings, have to be multidisciplinary. We have to be, in terms of how we think about any of our methods, in terms of what aspects of humanity we tend to focus on. And so that's where the multi-level stuff comes from, is that he insisted that it had to be that broad. And he absolutely didn't mean to be arrogant in saying that. He really thought that it was necessary to appreciate all of humanity for us to look that broadly. So I think that's something that I appreciate about Jim, and that I'm really thrilled to see people have picked up on successfully, right? So, for example, the notion we always had in social dominance theory, and you saw today, was that it's important to understand aspects of the theory in different contexts, but also across different levels of analysis. We saw it across different societies. We saw societal comparisons in Lota's talk, for example. We saw Arnold taking a particular racial history in the United States, but trying to generalize it theoretically. And he even saw it across age groups. So I think that it's a great testament that it's okay for people to try to think broadly, even if it means that they're going to find out, where there are shortcomings or where a general pattern doesn't fit so well. Another thing I think that Jim was really good at seeing that has become de rigueur and that we saw in all 4 talks today was the idea that people are not all living in the same situation even when they're living in the same society. And that's not something to trivialize, and it's not an accident. There's something systematic about that. And so it's really important that our social scientists attend very systematically and theoretically to why people are living in different situations. And perhaps, Jennifer's work was really exemplifying that, but in terms of saying, let's think about what is it like to be a poor person instead of to say, how do I as a middle class person assume it would be to be a poor person, right? And to have that sort of very naive and dominative point of view, but we also saw that in Arnold thinking about differences between how black and white and other raced people categorize multiracial people, and we also saw it in Stacy's telling us about graduation rates, for example, and how black and white students and Hispanic students interpret messages that they're receiving from different universities. So it's not, and I want to draw attention to the fact that I think they're exemplifying that it's not to say what's different and other about people who are in subordinated situations. They are people in subordinated situations and deserve, I think, every bit of our important theoretical and empirical attention, not to other them, but to understand that they're experiencing part of what humanity is experiencing and that it needs to be addressed. What else did they say? Let's see. I think another kind of sort of a parallel to the notion of the importance of thinking about people who are differently situated and actually theorizing that is something I can tell you. A long time ago, Jim thought he was looking at some data from Ed Cairns from Northern Ireland, and he was looking at correlations, and I can't even tell you between what. I think between religious sect identity and something else. And he noticed that there were differences between the numbers for Protestants and the numbers for Catholics. And that was the origin of the ideological asymmetry hypothesis, because he was really good at understanding patterns. And so when he was thinking and he was a very data-driven guy, as many of you know, but he not only cared about his own data, but he read other people's data to that level of detail where a lot of people would say, bah, you just ignore the bottom triangle in the correlation matrix, right? No, Jim was always comparing the two, top and the bottom half. And it is that kind of attention to detail as a scientist that let him, I think, that was a part of his expanding to try and have a theory that was general without overstating things, because it was really a theory written from one point of view that we're going to just say applies to everybody. And I'm sorry to say, but I think we tend to do that in the social sciences. We tend to write a theory that's really about, people like me, and then, assuming that it applies to everybody or else there's something wrong with you. And we've got to get away from that, right? And I really hope that social dominance theory is something that shows a different way to approach things. So related to this notion that you think about people as differently situated, I think that's also the case that there's kind of both an insiderness to social dominance theorizing and an outsiderness. And so what I mean by that is that on the one hand, it's saying things like Arnold was talking about, what are people's motives, right? And saying, what is it that you want from a particular situation and from a particular point of view? What is it you want? And so and clearly thinking about what low social dominance oriented people and what high social dominance oriented people is just one example about how you think about what does it mean from the inside to desire. But there's also in the theory an outsiderness, to step outside of what are common legitimizing myths and be critical of them, critical enough that you can call them legitimizing myths, critical enough that you could see that they may be serving a function that is not as stated. And I think that Jim's work had the ability to do that, and I think we saw that in the talks today. So, for example, we saw how Arnold was talking about how people in different racial categorized by racial people, and there's differences there. And we saw it in gender, looking at in Lota, looking at gender in small children and how they would form coalitions. But we also saw this really kind of critical notion of legitimizing myths in this idea of self-marketizing that Jennifer talked about, and in what's wrong with the middle class bias, and also in terms of Stacy's understanding of how the spin on why you would support diversity would sound different to different groups of people, and would perhaps, and serves different groups of people differently. And then finally, I think that you know, a sort of smaller but really key part of what Jim did was he really did care about the operationalization of institutions. And there's a couple of reasons for that. And I'll point out my friend Antonio Aiello is another person who's done this with social dominance theory. Institutions matter so much because they're part of what stabilize societies, and because they stabilize patterns of distribution so much more, and they do so much more distribution than individuals all added together could possibly do. And so, and I can't say that except for people who are interested in business, in IO psychology, that people in social psychology cared about that when we started working on the theory, not that I could tell. And that's really, work in those areas has really taken off, and it's a really useful thing because I think there's a greater appreciation and less fear that you're going to be called a communist or something if you study how institutions work. Now, I know for people in political science, the idea that you should study institutions is not exactly radical, which is good, right? And it's one of the reasons that we all benefit so much by coming together at ISPP to not be as insular and as undereducated as we might be if we didn't get to talk to colleagues who share different points of view. But in any case, the notion of understanding how institutions operate, how they're allocating things, and linking them even to larger social structure, and to larger political processes, which Stacy did in talking to us about Trump voting and how people were evaluating the institutional messages, was just really brilliant. So I would like to leave time for everybody else. I hope this has been helpful and not detracted from the 4 wonderful talks we heard. Thank you so much for organizing.